I'm Clara Nightwell, and I'm here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Tonight we're talking about one of the most powerful voices in literary history, Victor Hugo, a man whose stories shaped not only literature, but cinema, architecture, and the way we think about justice.
Most people know his characters, but few realize how deeply his work changed the real world.
His novels inspired generations of filmmakers, from silent cinema to modern adaptations. The tragic outsider, the doomed lover, the misunderstood monster. Those archetypes owe a great deal to Hugo.
And he didn't just create fictional worlds, he saved a real one.
When Notre Dame de Paris was falling into neglect, Hugo turned the cathedral into a living character in his novel. Public opinion shifted, restoration followed. A piece of history was preserved because of a book.
So tonight, we're stepping into the life of a man who believed stories could change the world, and proved it.
Victor Hugo.
Rowan, before Victor Hugo became this towering figure of literature and conscience, what kind of child was he?
Victor Hugo was born in 1802, into a France still trembling from revolution and empire. His childhood unfolded against a backdrop of political instability, shifting loyalties, and the lingering shadow of Napoleon. Even from a young age, he was surrounded by the idea that history was something violent, dramatic, and deeply personal. His father was a general in Napoleon's army, loyal to the empire, while his mother was a fierce royalist. That division inside his own home meant Hugo grew up hearing two completely different versions of what France was supposed to be.
So even as a boy, he was already living between opposing worlds.
Exactly! That tension between authority and rebellion, tradition and transformation would later become the emotional engine of his writing. Hugo was not raised inside a single ideology. He was raised inside conflict. As a teenager, he began writing poetry obsessively. He believed he was destined for greatness, and he said so openly. At a time when young people were expected to be obedient, Hugo declared that he would become either a famous poet or nothing at all.
That kind of confidence can sound arrogant, but it also sounds like someone who knows he has something to say.
He felt literature was not a hobby, it was a calling, and very quickly he was rewarded for that belief. His early poems earned him the attention of the royal court itself. King Louis XVI granted him a pension, turning Hugo into a kind of literary prodigy sponsored by the monarchy. At this point, he was still politically conservative, still aligned with the old order.
Which makes what he became later even more striking.
Exactly. His early success placed him inside the system he would later attack. He knew its language, its rituals, and its hypocrisies from the inside. And that knowledge would become one of his greatest weapons as a writer. Victor Hugo did not begin as a rebel. He became one, because he saw too clearly how power actually worked.
Rowan, when Victor Hugo embraced Romanticism, what was he really trying to change about how people saw the world?
When Hugo turned toward Romanticism, he was rejecting an entire civilization's idea of what truth and beauty were supposed to look like. Classical art had taught people that order was virtue, that restraint was elegance, and that anything chaotic or excessive was a flaw. Hugo looked at the streets of Paris, at the hunger, the desperation, the injustice, and he understood that this tidy version of reality was a lie. Life was not clean or balanced. It was violent, passionate, unfair, and often cruel. Romanticism was his way of tearing off the mask and showing the raw face underneath. He believed that if art was going to matter, it had to stop pretending that the world was comfortable for everyone. Hugo wanted to make emotion itself a form of truth. For him, tears, rage, love, and despair were not weaknesses. They were the deepest evidence of what it meant to be human. He believed that a novel or a play should not calm you, but disturb you. It should make you feel the suffering of others as if it were your own. That was why his stories are filled with people who are crushed by society, prisoners, beggars, outcasts, and children. He was telling his readers that these lives, which the powerful treated as disposable, were actually sacred. This was revolutionary in 19th century France. The ruling class wanted art that celebrated stability and hierarchy, art that reassured them that the world they controlled was natural and right. Hugo's Romanticism did the opposite. It exposed the pain hidden behind that order. It suggested that poverty was not fate, but injustice. That crime was not just evil, but often the result of desperation. In this way, Hugo was using literature as a moral weapon, not to preach, but to make people feel.
So even when he was writing fiction, he was really putting society on trial.
Exactly. Hugo believed that imagination could be more honest than realism. By exaggerating, by dramatizing, by turning suffering into epic tragedy, he could reveal truths that dry facts could never express. That is why his novels feel so large, so emotional, and sometimes almost overwhelming. They are not trying to be small and precise. They are trying to be morally undeniable. Through Romanticism, Hugo was saying that the world must be judged not by how elegant it looks, but by how it treats the most vulnerable people within it.
And Rowan, how did that romantic vision turn Victor Hugo into such a powerful and controversial public figure?
Once Hugo had committed himself to Romanticism, he was no longer just an artist. He became a cultural force. His plays, poems, and novels were not simply consumed, they were argued about, fought over, and feared. In a society still haunted by revolution, Hugo's writing felt dangerous because it made people question the moral foundations of the world they lived in. His stories did not politely entertain, they demanded that readers confront suffering, injustice, and the failures of the powerful. The famous premiere of his play Hernani in 1830 became a turning point in French culture. Supporters of Romanticism and defenders of classical tradition literally shouted at each other in the theater. It was not just about art, it was about which values would shape the future. Hugo's victory that night meant that emotion, imagination, and rebellion had won over restraint and tradition. From that moment on, Hugo was no longer simply writing books. He was shaping how an entire generation understood beauty, morality, and power. Young writers and artists looked to him as a leader, someone who had proven that art could challenge authority and survive. But this also made him dangerous to those in control. He was not just telling stories, he was changing how people thought. As his fame grew, so did his political consciousness. Hugo began to speak openly against the death penalty, against poverty, and against the cruelty of the ruling class. His novels gave faces and names to people society preferred to keep invisible. That made him deeply popular with ordinary readers and deeply threatening to those who benefited from injustice. Victor Hugo had become something rare and powerful, a writer whose imagination was strong enough to move an entire society. And when that happens, the powerful always begin to feel afraid.
Rowan, at what point did Victor Hugo's art turn fully into political conscience?
It happened when Hugo could no longer separate what he wrote from what he saw around him. As his fame grew, he began to witness the reality of 19th century France more clearly. The poverty in the streets, the children without homes, the prisoners forgotten behind stone walls, and the brutality of a legal system that punished the weak far more harshly than the powerful. His romantic imagination, which had always been drawn to suffering and injustice, could no longer stay in the realm of fiction. It began to demand action. Hugo entered public life and became a member of the French Parliament. But unlike many politicians of his time, he did not soften his words to maintain power. He used his fame to speak against the death penalty, against child labor, and against the crushing poverty created by the industrial age. He believed that a society could be judged by how it treated its most vulnerable. And when he looked at France, he saw a nation that claimed to be civilized while allowing enormous cruelty to exist in plain sight. His speeches were as passionate and dramatic as his novels, filled with moral urgency rather than polite compromise. This made him deeply loved by ordinary people and deeply hated by those in power. Hugo was no longer just a writer who described injustice. He was a man who named it, attacked it, and refused to look away. His voice carried weight because millions of readers already trusted him. When he spoke, it felt like the voice of conscience itself was speaking.
And that kind of voice is something no government can ever fully control. So Rowan, what happened when Victor Hugo's moral voice finally collided with real political power?
That collision came when Louis Napoleon Bonaparte seized power and declared himself emperor. Hugo saw this not as a return to order, but as a betrayal of everything France had fought for. Where others hesitated or stayed silent, Hugo spoke out openly, calling the new regime a lie built on fear and repression. His words made him an enemy of the state. Within days, he was forced to flee France. He left behind his home, his status, and the center of his cultural influence, and began a long exile that would last nearly 20 years. Hugo settled on the island of Guernsey, surrounded by sea and isolation. For most people, exile would have meant silence. For Hugo, it became one of the most productive periods of his life. Far from the reach of censorship, he wrote with even greater freedom and intensity. From this isolation came his greatest works. It was in exile that he wrote Les Misérables, a novel that would become one of the most powerful indictments of injustice ever created. He poured into it everything he had seen, everything he had felt, and everything he believed about humanity. The government had tried to silence him. Instead, it gave him the distance he needed to speak to the entire world.
Rowan, what was Victor Hugo's life like during those years of exile, when he was so far from France but still so deeply connected to it?
Exile transformed Hugo into something almost mythic. Living on the island of Guernsey, surrounded by the sea, he became a figure watching his country from a distance, like a prophet cut off from his own people. Every morning he would look across the water toward France, a physical reminder of the nation that had rejected him. Yet in that isolation, his imagination grew larger, not smaller. Hugo worked obsessively. He wrote for hours every day, often standing at a high desk by the window, as if the vastness of the ocean helped him think. His home became a kind of intellectual lighthouse, a place where ideas, memories, and outrage were constantly flowing. Letters from readers across Europe reached him, reminding him that even though he had been exiled from France, he had not been exiled from humanity. During these years, Hugo also became deeply interested in spiritualism, seances, and the idea that voices from beyond might speak through human beings. Whether or not one believes in this, it reflected something important about his state of mind. He felt himself to be a channel for forces larger than any one person: history, suffering, and justice. From this strange mixture of solitude, imagination, and moral fury came works that would define him forever. Les Misérables was not just a novel, it was a cry of pain and love for humanity. It carried the weight of everything Hugo had witnessed: the cruelty of law, the beauty of compassion, and the tragic dignity of people crushed by society. Exile did not silence Victor Hugo. It purified his voice.
And Rowan, how did the world respond when Victor Hugo finally returned from exile?
When the empire collapsed and Hugo was finally allowed to return to France, the country welcomed him not just as a writer, but as a living symbol. Crowds gathered to see him. People who had grown up reading his books felt as though a part of their own moral history was coming home. By this time, Les Misérables had already become a global phenomenon. It was read not only as a novel, but as a declaration of what a just society should look like. Hugo's characters had entered the collective imagination, shaping how people understood poverty, law, mercy, and redemption. Hugo himself became something larger than a man. He was a kind of national conscience. When he spoke, newspapers listened. When he criticized injustice, it echoed far beyond literary circles. His home in Paris turned into a place of pilgrimage, where young writers, artists, and thinkers came to seek inspiration. Victor Hugo had begun as a poet dreaming of greatness. He returned from exile as a moral force that no one could ignore.
Rowan, after everything Victor Hugo lived through, how did his work come to define what we remember him for today?
By the time Victor Hugo reached the final decades of his life, he was no longer simply an author. He was a living monument. His novels had escaped the boundaries of literature and entered the moral imagination of the world. Les Misérables, Notre Dame de Paris, and The Man Who Laughs were not just stories people read, they were stories people lived with. They shaped how generations understood injustice, compassion, and the tragic beauty of human suffering. Hugo had proven something extraordinary, that a novel could move society. Notre Dame de Paris had saved a cathedral from decay. Les Misérables had changed how people thought about prisons, poverty, and redemption. His books didn't merely entertain, they forced readers to look at the world differently. And his influence spread far beyond literature. His characters inspired theater, cinema, and eventually modern film. The tragic outsider, the scarred hero, the misunderstood monster. These figures live on today in everything from classic movies to contemporary storytelling. Even the Joker, one of cinema's most famous villains, traces his lineage back to Hugo's The Man Who Laughs. Victor Hugo did not just write books. He created a language for suffering, rebellion, and hope that the world is still speaking.
So Rowan, when we look at Victor Hugo from our own time, what does his life still tell us about who we are?
Victor Hugo's life tells us that words can outlive power. He faced emperors, censorship, exile, and ridicule, yet it was not their authority that endured, it was his imagination. His stories survived because they spoke to something deeper than politics. They spoke to the human heart. Even today, people still recognize themselves in Jean Valjean, in Quasimodo, in the broken figures Hugo loved so fiercely. Hugo believed that progress was not just technological or economic, but moral. He He believed that a society could only call itself civilized if it cared for its weakest members. That idea still challenges us, especially in a world that often values efficiency more than compassion. Through his romantic vision, Hugo reminded us that emotion is not a weakness. It is a source of truth. To feel deeply, to suffer with others, and to refuse indifference is what makes us human. His work asks us whether we are willing to be moved and changed by what we see. Victor Hugo did not just leave us books. He left us a mirror. And in that mirror, we still see our own struggle between cruelty and compassion, despair and hope.
Before we continue, I'd love to bring Margaret into the conversation. Margaret, for someone who's just discovering Victor Hugo, where should they start?
A wonderful place to begin is Les Miserables. It's not just Hugo's most famous novel. It's where his entire vision of justice, compassion, and human dignity comes together.
But it's such a big book. Is it really approachable for someone new to him?
It is, because beneath its size, it's deeply emotional and personal. You don't read it like history. You read it like a series of human lives unfolding. Hugo wanted you to feel every injustice and every moment of grace.
And what about the darker side of Hugo? The side that feels more disturbing?
That's beautifully captured in The Man Who Laughs. It's a haunting story about a man whose face has been mutilated to entertain the powerful. It explores how society turns suffering into spectacle, a theme that still feels painfully relevant.
That almost sounds like a modern story.
It really is. And for a different kind of beauty, I would also recommend Notre Dame de Paris. That novel doesn't just tell a story, it makes a building, a city, and a whole culture feel alive.
So together they show us Hugo's heart, his darkness, and his love for the world he was trying to save.
Exactly. Those three books give you Victor Hugo in full.
Marcel, when people hear the word romanticism, they often think of love stories and drama, but what was it really about?
Romanticism was a revolt against a world that tried to turn human life into something mechanical and obedient. It was born from the feeling that reason alone could not explain what it meant to suffer, to love, or to long for freedom. Romantic artists wanted to restore mystery, emotion, and the sublime to a society that was becoming cold and bureaucratic. Its main characteristics were intensity, imagination, and a deep respect for individual experience. Romanticism celebrated the outsider, the rebel, the dreamer, and the misunderstood. It preferred ruins over palaces, storms over calm skies, and passionate heroes over obedient citizens.
And that connects so strongly with Victor Hugo's characters.
It does. Hugo, like Alexandre Dumas in literature, or Richard Wagner in music, or Delacroix in painting, believed that art should overwhelm you. These creators wanted to build emotional worlds where history, myth, and human suffering collided. Romanticism was also deeply connected to revolution. The French Revolution shattered old hierarchies, and Romantic artists took that energy and turned it into culture. In Latin America, Romanticism gave voice to independence movements and national identity. In the United States, it shaped writers who believed that nature and the individual spirit were sacred.
So it wasn't just a European style, it was a global way of feeling.
Exactly. Romanticism was the artistic soul of a world learning to reject empires and to imagine freedom.
Rowan, earlier we mentioned that massive section about the Battle of Waterloo in Les Miserables. Was Hugo really being historically accurate there, or was he doing something else?
Hugo was not trying to write a military report. He was doing something far more romantic. He took real historical events and transformed them into a moral and emotional landscape. The movements of armies, the chaos, the blood, and the chance that decided Napoleon's fate were all real. But Hugo shaped them into a story about destiny, failure, and the collapse of an era. He mixed historical fact with imagination because his goal was not precision, it was meaning. He wanted the reader to feel the weight of history pressing down on individual lives. In that sense, Waterloo in Les Miserables is not a textbook. It is a tragedy. And that approach is exactly why Victor Hugo's legacy is so powerful. He showed that stories could reshape how people understand the past, the present, and themselves. His influence on cinema is enormous, from epic historical dramas to stories about outsiders, rebels, and tragic heroes. The visual language of modern film owes a great deal to the way Hugo told stories, big emotions, big stakes, and deeply human characters. In the wider Romantic movement, Hugo stands as one of its greatest architects. He proved that art could be both beautiful and politically dangerous, both poetic and revolutionary. He helped give the 19th century a new voice, one that spoke for the forgotten and the broken. Victor Hugo did not just reflect his time, he challenged it, and that is why his words still echo in ours.
Thank you, Rowan, for sharing this journey through Victor Hugo with us tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a beautiful story to tell.
And to everyone listening, if you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.